Welcome back to the FPS podcast, another deep dive in our climate adaptation series. Today, we're zeroing in on SoilWeb, a tool that's making waves in forestry. It's all about helping you adapt and thrive out there, and that really ties into the Forest Business School's whole mission of supporting professional growth.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hot topic right now. Our recent assessment, the Vermont Forest Products Supply Chain Climate Adaptation Needs Assessment, showed just how much folks are craving better planning tools.
For sure, that report said what was it, almost 65% of the people they talked to wanted those better planning tools.
Yeah.
So what makes this SoilWeb thing so different? The article by BIC made it sound like, well, it's not just another version of the Web Soil Survey.
It's about taking all that awesome soil data from the USDA and making it instantly useful, like right out in the field where it matters. So picture this, you pull it up on your phone, find your spot on the map using Google Maps, no less, and boom, you've got all this soil data right there on top of your work area.
So no more lugging around those heavy laptops or trying to, make sense of paper maps out in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly. Plus, you can switch between different views like satellite or terrain, which, helps you get the whole picture.
Huge time saver. But let's get to the good stuff. What kind of information are we talking about? Is it just basic soil types, or does it, go deeper than that?
Oh, way deeper. Think soil texture, drainage class, how often it floods, all those things that climate change is making, well, a bit less predictable. And that's where SoilWeb can really help us get ready for future problems and, make our operations tougher.
BIC's article talked about a feature called map unit composition. What is that exactly?
Okay, so imagine you're planning a harvest. Map unit composition shows you the main soil types in that area, so before you even get out there, you have an idea of what you're going to be dealing with.
So instead of just reacting to problems when they happen, you can get ahead of them.
Right. Let's say it shows a lot of clay soil. Knowing that, you might decide to wait for a drier time to do your harvest to, minimize the risk of rutting.
Makes sense. Or maybe you decide to use equipment that's easier on the soil, especially with all this heavy rain we've been seeing lately.
Absolutely. And speaking of rain, SoilWeb gives you actual data on how often an area floods. It's not just vague terms, it actually says none, rare, occasional, frequent, or very frequent, based on what's happened in the past.
So you can actually, plan your roads and bridges with that in mind.
Exactly. It's about making our infrastructure tougher, and that lines up perfectly with what folks were saying in that Vermont assessment.
Okay, so we're minimizing risks, but what about doing things more efficiently? Can SoilWeb help with that too?
For sure. Think about choosing the right equipment. SoilWeb gives you all the details about sand and clay content, which is super important for knowing how a particular soil is going to act, in different conditions.
So if you're on a site with a lot of clay, which can get pretty messy when it's wet, SoilWeb might suggest using that low ground pressure equipment to avoid causing damage.
Right. You're adapting your approach based on the data, and that can save you, well, time, money, and headaches down the road. But SoilWeb isn't just for the immediate harvest. It's also useful for the long term.
I saw that as something called site index curves. What are those all about?
Site index curves show you how tall different tree species are likely to grow on a specific site. That can be a real game changer for reforestation, especially with climate change, messing with those ideal growing conditions.
So you could use SoilWeb to pick trees that are more likely to do well in the future climate of that area?
Precisely. We're talking long-term planning here, making sure our forests stay healthy and productive for generations to come.
So we've talked about some of the basic data, but BIC's article also mentioned a whole bunch of forestry suitability ratings.
Right.
What are those about?
Think of them as SoilWeb's way of turning all that complicated soil data into something you can actually use. They tell you how suitable a site is for different forestry activities, taking things like soil type, slope, and even climate data into account. You've got ratings for everything from the risk of rutting to how suitable a spot is for a log landing.
Sounds like we're about to get into the really interesting stuff.
Oh, okay. Let's dig into those suitability ratings. One that really stands out, especially with the climate changing, is soil rutting hazard.
Rutting is a real pain, and it feels like with all the heavy rain we've been getting, the ground just stays wet longer. How does SoilWeb help with that?
Well, the soil rutting hazard rating basically tells you how likely a soil is to get rutted based on things like how many times equipment goes over it and how wet the soil is. And it's not just a simple yes or no. You get a rating, from slight to severe.
So if I see a severe rating on SoilWeb, for a potential harvest area, that's a bad sign, right?
Yeah, you definitely want to take a closer look. You might want to hold off on the harvest until things dry out a bit, or, figure out how much it might cost to fix any damage and adjust your budget accordingly.
That brings us back to what that Vermont assessment was saying about, you know, changing harvest schedules to like minimize soil impacts. SoilWeb gives us the info to do that.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears and look at some ratings related to infrastructure. We've got potential erosion hazard, log landing suitability, and construction limitations. These are super important for, building things that can hold up, especially with all this crazy weather.
Let's start with potential erosion hazard. What kind of information does that give us?
This rating looks at, how likely it is that soil will erode after something like a harvest or road construction.
Yeah.
It considers things like how steep the slope is, the type of soil, and what kind of vegetation is there. And with these heavier rains, understanding erosion risk is, well, more important than ever.
So a high potential erosion hazard rating means I need to be really careful and probably put some erosion control measures in place, right?
Exactly. You might want to use things like silt fences or, strategically placed / you could even change the way your roads and skid trails are laid out to minimize runoff. SoilWeb gives you that heads up so you can be proactive.
Okay, so we're minimizing erosion.
Mm-hmm.
What about the log landing suitability rating? How can that help us work more efficiently?
Choosing the right spot for a log landing is crucial. A bad landing can lead to all sorts of problems like soil compaction, erosion, and even safety hazards.
Yeah, nobody wants to see their equipment getting stuck in the mud.
Exactly. The log landing suitability rating looks at things like equipment access, how stable the soil is, and if there are any potential drainage problems.
So I could use SoilWeb to find those perfect spots that minimize my costs and reduce my impact on the environment.
Exactly. Now, the construction limitations rating, that goes back to that need for resilient infrastructure we talked about before. It doesn't just look at soil type. It also considers things like the slope, how likely it is to slip, and even how deep the bedrock is.
It's all about building roads and the infrastructure that can last, especially with all this extreme weather.
Exactly. The Vermont assessment showed that we really need to improve in that area, and SoilWeb gives us the data to make better decisions about, where and how we build.
So we've got ratings that help us avoid rutting, minimize erosion, pick the right log landing spots, and build tough infrastructure. Anything else SoilWeb can do?
There's one more rating worth mentioning, harvest equipment operability. This one looks at how well different types of logging equipment can work on a specific soil type, under different moisture levels and terrain conditions.
So I could use SoilWeb to pick the most efficient equipment for a particular site, based on those ratings.
Exactly. You're matching your equipment to the conditions, and that can save you time and money, and also, reduce your impact on the forest.
It's like having a virtual consultant in your pocket, helping you make those smart choices every step of the way.
Right.
But even with all this amazing data, there's still a human element, right?
Absolutely. SoilWeb is a great tool, but it's not a replacement for actual experience and good judgment.
Yeah.
Bick's article emphasized how important it is to, use SoilWeb regularly, really get to know it, and make adjustments to your interpretations based on what you're seeing on the ground.
So it's about combining that data with our own knowledge and intuition. We're not just blindly following what SoilWeb tells us.
And let's not forget about collaboration. That Vermont assessment talked about how important it is to share knowledge in the forestry community. Imagine foresters getting together, talking about SoilWeb data, comparing notes, and, figuring out the best practices together.
Yeah, that kind of shared learning is essential for adapting to these, constantly changing conditions. We're all in this together.
Speaking of being in it together, let's think about you, the listener. Imagine you're trying to make a tough decision on your own property. Maybe you're thinking about thinning some trees, or maybe you need to change your harvest schedule because of the weather. How could SoilWeb help you make that decision?
That's a great question. We've covered a lot today, exploring how SoilWeb can help us adapt and, really succeed in the face of climate change.
Before we wrap things up, let's take a minute to go over some of the key things we've learned and leave you with one final thought-provoking question.
So let's recap what we've learned about SoilWeb.
It's all about, taking all that data from the USDA soil survey and putting it right there, on your phone.
Easy to access when you need it.
And that's so important for adaptation, like we saw in that Vermont Forest Products Supply Chain Climate Adaptation Needs Assessment.
Yeah, being able to plan based on good data when the weather's so unpredictable and soil conditions are changing, that's huge.
And SoilWeb is great at that, like with those forestry suitability ratings. It takes all that complicated soil science stuff and turns it into something you can actually use to make smart decisions.
Think about
SoilWeb can help you find areas that might be prone to rutting. It can help you figure out the risks of erosion, even find those good spots for log landings.
It's about, doing things efficiently and minimizing your impact, which is, well, more important than ever these days.
And it's not just reacting to problems. SoilWeb lets you get ahead of them.
You can choose the right equipment, plan for reforestation, even build stuff that can stand up to the weather. It's like having, it's like having a guide to help you deal with all the challenges of climate change and forestry.
And it's important to remember that SoilWeb, well, it's a tool, and it works best when you combine it with, your own experience and what other folks in the forestry community know.
That's where the Forest Business School comes in.
Yeah.
We're all about sharing knowledge, offering workshops and training where you can really get into SoilWeb, share what you know, and develop those best practices together.
It's about building a better future for our forests, giving you the knowledge and tools you need to succeed.
So here's something to think about. Thinking back on all the challenges we've talked about today, how could you use SoilWeb to make your operation more resilient?
Go check out SoilWeb, explore it for yourself, and see how it can help you adapt and thrive. The Forest Business School is here to support you every step of the way.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.